This is T West. Welcome to AfriSynergy, news and information on Africa and the African diaspora. Muammar Gaddafi promoted Islamization crusade of Africa. I will first start with the words of U.S. Senator John Kerry, which he spoke at the recent 2012 Democratic National Convention, nominating Barack Obama for serving a second term as President of the United States.
When a brutal dictator promised to hunt down and kill his own people like rats, President Obama enlisted our allies, built the coalition, shared the burden, so that today, without a single American casualty, Muammar Gaddafi is gone and the people of Libya are free. He said we should have intervened in Libya sooner. Then he ran down a hallway to run away from the reporters who were asking questions. Then he said the intervention was too aggressive. And then he said the world was a better place because the intervention succeeded. Talk about being for it before you were against it.
It's important to know what was happening in Libya at the time Gaddafi made the statement about hunting down the rats, murdering innocent people in a number of cities in Libya, starting in the eastern cities such as Benghazi. These Libyan rats were doing what American Army Sergeant Anthony Pettin, who is 25 years of age, and Private Isaac Igwigi, who is 19, and Army Private First Class Michael Burnett, who is 26 years of age, and Private Christopher Salmon, who is 25 years of age, all serving in the United States Army in the state of Georgia. They were planning to blow up a dam, poison apples in the state of Washington, and also assassinate the American president, all towards the goal of overthrowing the United States government. I suggest all of you follow the Heinz Company, a company owned by the wife of John Kerry. See whether or not and how quickly, if this quickly engages, or this company quickly engages itself in Libya to earn profits. As well, it would also be insightful to follow which public or private corporations that John Kerry is heavily invested in relative to profits from war. If Libya was such a great success and its people were liberated from the type of dictator that Senator John Kerry or Barack Obama claims, I'm sure we would have American journalists with videos and pictures being beamed back with the success stories in Libya. But that is not the case. The reality is that this is not happening because Libya is not a success story, except for those who want to make money from a weak Libyan leadership who are indebted to France, Britain, the United States, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. We have heard the lies about the success in Iraq, but every week we see bombs like this in Iraq.
Some international stories this hour. Iraq is reeling under a series of violent attacks today. Several car bombs rocked cities including Amara, Kirkuk, and western Basra, and gunmen attacked checkpoints into Crete Fallujah and Abu Ghraib. At least 79 people are dead and 270 others wounded. Iraq's vice president has been sentenced to death in absentia. He fled the country months ago after allegedly being involved in the deaths of a lawyer and an Iraqi army general. He's also accused of running a death squad. The VP says he is being targeted because he is Sunni Muslim, and he accused Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki of pushing the country towards a religious divide. What is going on in Iraq?
This all goes back to something we've talked about here before on the program, and that is this concern by Sunnis in Iraq that they are being sidelined, disenfranchised from the political system.
Vice President is appealing to people to stay calm. The wave of bombings across Iraq left 94 people dead, more than 300 wounded on Sunday. This came on the same day a court in Baghdad found Vice President Tariq al-Hashmi guilty of ordering attacks on officials and security forces. Al-Hashmi says that he's now been living in self-imposed exile in Turkey, and he denies these charges against him, says that the death sentence is now politically motivated.
Nouri al-Maliki, the Prime Minister, he's a Shiite, of course, and part of the deal when the Americans started to draw down was there would be a power-sharing government involving Sunni, Shia, and Kurds as well as others. This has not happened, and you've had Sunnis claiming that al-Maliki is becoming a dictator of sort. He's been described as Saddam Light, and that the Sunnis are not being named to the positions that they were meant to be named in, being pushed to the sidelines out of key posts. This is where a lot of this comes from. And al-Hashmi, who was widely respected within the Sunni community, all of a sudden gets wind that he's going to be charged with basically capital crime. So he gets up north to Kurdistan and then goes across into Turkey.
Is he powerful? Does he have any sway whatsoever now that he's out of the country? Can he do anything?
He doesn't have any sway, but he certainly has a lot of support among Sunnis, and this is where you're seeing this violence ratcheting up. It's the local Al-Qaeda affiliate, the Islamic State of Iraq, it's called, which is kind of an umbrella group. You've got Al-Qaeda certainly involved, but you've also got other Sunni Islamist groups, also remnants of the old Saddam Ba'ath Party, who are behind all of this violence, and it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. You know, every month there's been a major coordinated attack. In July, 350 people were killed.
Why is this happening now, though, Michael? The timing of all this. I mean, obviously, you know, people are looking at the situation. A lot of people see that you went into Iraq thinking that eventually there would be home building, nation building, and this hasn't happened.
The United States and its allies brought this hell to Iraq and has now brought it to Libya and Syria. It is a cruel, deadly game of dividing and creating chaos, an environment in which the profits of Western corporations are usually at their highest. For Western nations in time of great economic trouble, which we are in right now, they create hell on earth in order to create a new economic order for themselves, where they re-extend themselves economically.
There is no peace there.
It was a pretty naive notion to go into Iraq and think that that would happen, to be honest, and I think a lot of people look back on it now and see it that way. I mean,
this same CNN journalist and many others from other media sources helped promote some of the war in Iraq. This particular journalist has been promoting lies and propaganda on behalf of the terrorists operating in Syria under various names, including Free Syrian Army. It is grand hypocrisy what you hear him stating here. He and others promoted the same anarchy in Libya and will always use the words cruel dictator when mentioning the name of Muammar Gaddafi.
There was never going to be built a democracy in the Western style in Iraq. There's too many disparate groups.
If there was never going to be the type of democracy United States and European media has been and are promoting in these countries that they have turned into hell on earth, why is the United States and European military in these countries? The answer is new markets for Western corporations and to short-circuit economic and military growth in those countries.
And even now, you also, between the central government and the Kurds in the north, who are largely autonomous, they're having their own issues too, largely about oil revenues, but about other things as well. It's a country that has a lot of tribal and religious differences. It always has been. And this goes back to the whole thing of, you know, what is Iraq but lines drawn on a map after World War I, where, you know, the West basically said, that's Iraq, everyone get along, as they did with most of the Middle East. And it's you see these old fractured divisions that just keep coming to the surface. A lot of people even now in Iraq, I was talking to a friend of mine in Baghdad this morning who said that even now you're hearing Iraqis talking about maybe dividing the country again.
It is very clear who the devils are, who come to steal and kill and then divide. Who are those who do this? It is those who come in the name of democracy and claim they come to fight against terrorism. However, everywhere they go, terrorism and decadence increase.
Which either into autonomous regions or into three separate states.
So it was such a controversial proposal. It was one that Joe Biden was pushing and was rejected.
And everyone poo-pooed it. And now even Iraqis are starting to talk about that. There's also the regional problems too, the Syrian conflict. The Shiite government of Nouri al-Maliki is worried that if the rebels win there and they end up with a Sunni-dominated government there, they may help sponsor more of the Sunni insurgency within Iraq.
The entire goal is to inflame the entire Near East and East. It is to turn those against each other who previously were not against each other. It is to set each upon the throat of the other. In Libya, Gaddafi did not set Sufi against Salafi. In Iraq, Saddam did not set Sunni against Shia or against the Kurds, as we see has occurred under those from the West who proclaim that they come to bring peace, democracy, and prosperity.
The following is an analysis of the response to an article about Gaddafi's visit to Italy in 2010, demanding that Europe play its part in preventing African immigrants from illegally entering Europe by way of Libya. There are 3 reasons why I'm doing a program such as this. One is to set straight the story about Muammar Gaddafi. Secondly is to show how other leaders in Africa are demonized wrongfully, such as, for example, Robert Mugabe. But they're demonized wrongfully by Europeans, Americans, and even some Africans who have been indoctrinated by the Europeans and the Americans. And thirdly, so that you may understand the methods and know what to look for and reject. The article was entitled Gaddafi on Black Libya, Islamization Project for Black Africans, a response. The author of the response proposed that Muammar Gaddafi's agenda was the Islamization of Black Africa. We are going to evaluate the merits of this assumption. The article. Gaddafi, the Libyan leader and the erstwhile chairman of the African Union, landed in Italy on Sunday and made brute racist remarks which explicitly betrayed his gross disdain for black African people and called to question the true intention behind his zeal for African unity. Now, clearly, this author, not unlike a number of African leaders and their followers, has made his points clear on his thoughts about Muammar Gaddafi. This article was dated September the 4th, 2010, prior to the planned uprising in Libya. What this writer is saying is intended to sway the opinion of others as well as buttress those who already have this opinion of Muammar Gaddafi. Now the article. Addressing the European Union in Rome, Gaddafi warned that Europe runs the risk of turning black unless the European Union pays Libya at least 5 billion pounds a year to block the arrival of illegal immigrants from Africa. He continued, tomorrow Europe might no longer be European and even black, as there are millions who want to come in. He described the immigration pattern as something very dangerous. Now, so far, nothing racist about this statement of facts from Gaddafi. It is true that millions of Africans were and continue to dance with death within hostile Arab countries and upon the oceans attempting to reach European countries, thinking they will achieve a better life. At that time, the racist mixed-breed Arabs of Libya's city of Misrata were attacking African immigrants and killing some of them in Libya. This forced Gaddafi to crack down on those Libyans. Was this very dangerous for the African immigrants in the coastal city of Misrata, many seeking passage to Europe? Yes, of course it was. It was dangerous for these Africans and dangerous for Muammar Gaddafi as well, because it projected an image of him standing up for African immigrants and not the racist mixed breed Arabs of Misrata. It was an example of divide and rule on the part of the Europeans. Italy knew this was creating an unstable situation in Libya, forcing Gaddafi to either protect the African immigrants and be despised by the racists among the Arabs of Libya, or allow this abuse of the African immigrants to continue and be demonized as a racist. I say this because the European Union had agreed to set aside money to address this illegal immigration issue, but was not paying to prevent such illegal immigration. In other words, the European Union was not adhering to its end of the bargain.
In October of 2000, BBC reported that thousands of African immigrants living in Libya have been attacked by local residents. Some have had to take refuge in their respective embassies. Even a year before this civil war erupted, the United Nations warned that Libya must end its practices of racial discrimination against black Africans, particularly its racial persecution of 2 million black African migrant workers. There is substantial evidence of Libya's pattern and practice of racial discrimination against migrant workers. So when the armed rebellion started in Libya in February of this year, that is 2011, it quickly took on a race war element where the black minority were beaten, raped, lynched, murdered, and driven from their homes and communities, regardless of whether they were Libyan or not. And what I have been indicating is that NATO is behind the killings that continue in Libya, the targeting of blacks in Libya. And NATO targeted blacks itself in Libya in 2011.
Muammar Gaddafi was correct in stating that the migration pattern is something that is very dangerous. Africans were dying in the hundreds in overloaded boats at sea. Others were being beaten in parts of Libya, and others were even being harvested for their organs in Egypt and left dead in the deserts. Yes, I would call that migration pattern very dangerous. Of course, the racist author of the article is not going to say these truths. The article. If one analyzes Gaddafi's statements critically, it comes out clear that he is essentially Europe. You need to protect your prestigious white identity and prevent it from being blackened by the influx of black African people. Now, of course, these are the words of the author. He is taking the liberty of putting words into Muammar Gaddafi's mouth. Again, this is 2010, leading up to what happened in Libya. They were already setting the groundwork for doing what they did in Libya. There is no question that Muammar Gaddafi is appealing to the Europeans to come up to their end of the bargain, or it will be faced with a greater increase in immigrants from Africa, which are undesirable to the average Western European. The European leaders were content with watching African immigrants' numbers grow in Libya, and Gaddafi ensuring that they do not go any further than Libya. The article. He is actually playing the race card quite subtly by appealing to the racial prejudice of the European people. Thus, he not only referred to the potential risk posed by illegal immigrants as undesirable consequences, but also that black faces in Europe, whether illegal or otherwise, in itself constitutes a danger to white European identity. Now, there is really never a need for anyone to, as this author states, play the race card subtly or otherwise. Most Europeans for centuries have been trained to look at Africans and African numbers among them as a bad thing, not a good thing. The author is grasping for straws with this statement. Gaddafi is first and foremost referring to the dangers these immigrants face when attempting to immigrate into Europe without proper documentation. Some of these dangers I have already mentioned. Gaddafi also realized that some Europeans may be blocking the role that they were supposed to be playing in preventing illegal immigration by not paying what they promised to pay in handling the situation before it even reaches the shores of Europe. For example, if 10,000 African immigrants show up on the shores of Libya looking for boats to smuggle them into Europe, who is to pay the cost when those persons are caught and need to be shipped back to their respective countries, their countries of origin? The Europeans had already agreed to cover some of these costs, but as the British did with the Lancaster Agreement relative to Zimbabwe, when they said that they would take care of the situation with white farmland ownership, they reneged on that promise. The promises of the Europeans were not kept, and in this case, it was the same. The native peoples of the United States have a long list of broken promises. The article: Gaddafi bolstered his dislike for black people and then projected his own racial bias on white European Christians when he further remarked, "We don't know what will happen, what will be the reaction of the whites and Christian Europeans faced with this influx of starving and ignorant Africans." Again, he is attributing those words to Muammar Gaddafi. Here you see the author bridle leading those blacks to think what he wants them to think. Starving and ignorant Africans, yes, many of them, under the conditions they have placed themselves, were starving. They were stranded and often at the mercies of smugglers who will take them for everything they have if given the opportunity. Ignorant? Yes, of course. They are ignorant to put themselves in such a position and throw their lives to such perils based upon illusions of the false dreams projected through American and European movies. Fools chase after illusions. Africa is a rich continent, but there are an abundance of fools who risk their lives running to countries that despises them and enslaved those who preceded them on such journeys, shackled in the hulls of ships as cargo. The article: After casting slur on the blackness of sub-Saharan African people, he unabashedly called on Europe to open its borders to Libyan citizens. There is also desirable immigration. There are Libyans who have money, and I encourage them to come to Italy to invest. Well, these are two totally different issues. The author assumes that blackness is only represented in sub-Saharan Africa. However, according to most estimates, up to 1/3 of Libya's population was made up of black Libyans, excluding immigrants from other African countries. Under Gaddafi, we saw black Libyans represented in various capacities. Today, we don't see black Libyans represented in the government established by Europeans, represented by the Europeans, by the Americans, and by the Arab League. If we are looking for racism, I'm sure this is a glaring example. The article: After his speech, one Italian minister criticized the Libyan leader of keeping tens of thousands of African migrants in concentration camps in the desert. This was reported by the Telegraph of the United Kingdom. Now, this author has the gall to quote an Italian a member of a group of people who have done great damage in Africa since the time of the Roman Empire to this very day. We cannot forget what the Italians did to Somalis and what they did to Ethiopian men and women, hanging and beheading them during their invasions in the 1930s and prior to that. We cannot forget what they did to the same in Libya when they invaded Libya. Europe has promised to pay Libya to detain those immigrants who entered Libya with the intent of illegally entering into Europe. The Italians' choice of using the words concentration camps was staged with the intent and purpose of making Gaddafi appear as Adolf Hitler or some of their other respected mass killers in Europe. Europe agreed to pay Libya to hold and to move these people back to their respective home countries. Notice, leading up to and after NATO started attacking Libya in March of 2011, that the governments of the African countries from which most of these immigrants came were not in any rush to rescue their own people. Prior to that, we did not see any Africans starved to skin and bones in these so-called concentration camps in Libya. Simply, the shoe does not fit. How long will it take before many of you blacks stop parroting, echoing the lies and the interpretations of the devils among the whites and mixed breed Arabs? The author waxes even more poignant when he states, Gaddafi's blunt disrespect for black people in general calls to question the intention behind his call for African unity. Well, here it is. We have a continent with more than 53 nations with boundaries mostly constructed by the various European powers with the intent of dividing them. And we have ignorant Negroes questioning why Muammar Gaddafi was calling for a united Africa. Kwame Nkrumah called for the same, and these same types of Negroes got in the way and constructed an excuse as to why Nkrumah was calling for such and why it must be opposed. Of course, since Muammar Gaddafi is Muslim, the Negro grasps for the obvious. That is, he's trying to convert all of us in Africa to Islam. When I saw the black woman security guards traveling with Muammar Gaddafi with their hair sometimes uncovered, wearing khakis with pistols on their sides, I knew this was an assault upon the phony religious leaders of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and elsewhere. However, the Negro says, many scholars believe Gaddafi has a hidden agenda against black Africans and that the African Union was simply a means for him to further his religious and political ambitions in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, what has most of these so-called scholars done to promote the advancement of Africans and its people scattered around the world? Most of them are all talk and peddlers of their books, and not much more than that. The article then goes on to say, one such scholar, Professor Kwesi Kwa-Pro, alleged in 2004 that Gaddafi's true objective in the African Union is to create a space for Arabism and Arab expansionism. Now, those are the words of the author, quoting this professor in South Africa. Well, to determine what motivates people to say what they say, often we need to go no further than following the money trail. At the time when this was attributed to having been said by Professor Pro, his knowledge was limited on this subject matter. It is very clear that Gaddafi was a politician and would sometimes use words to manipulate situations to bring about certain results. Gaddafi was purported to have once said in the 1980s, Darfur was poor and backwards because it was insufficiently Arabized. It had missed out in the great adhesion to the Muslim Ummah because its Islam was primitive and insufficiently Arabic. The situation was pregnant with the potential for enormous destruction because it fitted only too well within the border context of racial prejudice in the Sudan. Realize that Arab leaders did not like Muammar Gaddafi, and the final conclusion of them colluding with the whites of Europe and of America to murder Gaddafi proves this. It is very important to know whose water men such as Professor Kwesi Kwarteng are sometimes carrying, and in whose company their words are found. For example, Gerard Prunier, he is a Frenchman. This Frenchman has been and remained the biggest enemy of African progress. Yet we find Prunier prominently featured in pitting Africans against each other with the Islam card attributed to Prunier. The following was stated. During the 1980s, Gaddafi, as self-appointed leader and modern prophet of the Arab world, distributed vast quantities of arms in Darfur. How long have we, black people in the United States, heard similar words uttered by white men, such as self-appointed? They want you and those who would listen to you to believe you have no credibility unless they have bestowed such credibility upon you. Be aware that it was Gerard Prunier alone who is stating that Gaddafi is the, quote, self-appointed leader and modern prophet of the Arab world. What do you think this does to the minds of Arabs in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, or elsewhere? It sows the seeds of envy, of hate, something the French are quite good at doing, but not as good as the British. At the same time, we have Bernard Henry Levy, who is operating towards the same goal as Gerard Prunier. These are long-term operatives who are well connected and plugged in, well financed. In policy, Prunier is also all over Africa, but not in the interest of human rights, but in the interest of France. Of course, all of them uses the rhetoric of human rights to gain acceptance in Africa. Why then would Professor Kwesi Kwarteng be quoted in support of the likes of Bernard Henry Levy and Gerard Prunier? Prunier stated the following about Gaddafi. The plan was to get rid of Africans and replace them with Arabs. It is the same Gaddafi who said at a press conference in Amman at an Arab League summit meeting in October of 2000 that 2/3 of Arabs live in Africa and the remaining third must join the other 2/3 in Africa. Again, those are the words of Gerard Prunier about Muammar Gaddafi. Put aside your emotions and think for a moment. Are Arabs going to leave Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and other Arab states to go and live in Africa? Under what conditions would such happen? My point is that there is no context to what Gerard Prunier is stating. Therefore, the question, why is he saying it? The best answer I have is that it is intended for the purpose of manipulating you, the African people. Aren't you all tired of being manipulated and by these marauding conquerors, the thugs, the rapists, the deceivers, the thieves, and the enslavers? Aren't you tired of it? You should be. If you're not, I question your sanity. The whole truth is that after 2001, Gaddafi referred to Arabs, which he is not an Arab, as backstabbers and stabbing each other in the back often. It is important to understand that Muammar Gaddafi was sometimes quite humorous, knowing that the 1/3 of Arabs outside of Africa would never move into Africa so long as he was alive. He was teasing them because they knew Gaddafi carried great influence in Africa, to the envious dislike of some of the African leaders. Prunier attempted to use this as a means to further divide Africans and Arabs. Some African scholars parroted what European scholars were first to interpret and promote as the geopolitical religion relative to Muammar Gaddafi. The author goes on to say, readers are invited to take critical note of the expression, the only space we have. What was he implying exactly? Those are the words of the author, which are attributed also to Prunier. Gaddafi was not implying anything. He was jabbing at the Arab kings, the puppets of the Zionist West. These Arab leaders knew they did not have the influence Gaddafi had in Africa, and Gaddafi certainly knew it. Essentially, Gaddafi was teasing them. These are the same Arab leaders in such countries as Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, as well as Qatar, who defies the United Nations boycott on charcoal coming from Kismayu and Merku in Somalia. Money from this is used to fund Al-Shabaab in Somalia. The article. Broadcasting live on Rwanda TV on 17th of May, 1985, Gaddafi said to Rwandans, "You must teach that Islam is the religion of Africa. We must wage a holy war so that Islam may spread in Africa." Now this was the quote by this author. He was quoting a couple of other guys, Banki and Machombu. Again, whether Gaddafi said this or not, it must be placed within the context of what was happening at that time. Apartheid was still strong in South Africa. Gaddafi was being blamed for the hijacking of an Egyptian passenger plane in Malta on November 23, 1985. This is a hijacking where Egypt, after refusing the U.S. Delta Force's invitation or refusing their offer to assist them, that the Egyptian forces themselves, they stormed that hijacked plane, which resulted in the plane going up in a firebomb, killing most of the people. Now, one of the hijackers survived, Omar Mohammed Ali Razak, and he served time in prison in Malta. Then after being released from prison, he was flying back to Africa when a United States jet intercepted his plane, which resulted in Omar serving a life sentence in prison in the United States. Gaddafi, by no means, promoted Islam as stated by this author. Had he been doing so, the Arab states such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and even Turkey would not have all been aligned against him for many years. Libya was quite a secular country, much like Iraq was prior to the United States military invasion. And we see what's happening in Iraq on a daily basis. And earlier in this program, I showed you a video of explosions and killings in Iraq. More than 90 people were killed and hundreds were injured across Iraq in bombings. The article. It came as no surprise that in a second speech he delivered to paid Italian women on his recent visit to Rome, he declared to them Islam should become the religion of Europe, and then handed them free copies of the Quran. This means nothing other than a suggestion to those women. That is, he used the word should. He didn't use the word you must or you will convert to Islam. Now, other people do the same thing with their religions. They say you should convert to Christianity, or you should convert to Judaism, you should convert to whatever. Those Arabs fighting on the side of the Zionist West insist that Islam become the norm in countries around the world and are blowing up people towards their evil goal. Gaddafi never did such things or allowed such things. The article. If Gaddafi is going as far as telling Europeans to adopt Islam and in effect become Islamic states governed by the Sharia, What stops him from pursuing his Arab expansionist mission in sub-Saharan Africa and its ignorant and starving masses, using his oil cash as a lure to trap some self-seeking African leaders into his deceptive trap? These words have no merit, but are much supposition. Again, what we see are whites and their parroting blacks promoting the agenda of the Europeans. The only trap that Africans have been snared in has been the false Jews, the European Christians, and the puppet Arabs of Saudi Arabia and surrounding Arab states. Gaddafi never enslaved blacks in Libya, but he did have high-ranking blacks within the Libyan military and government. Again, that is not the case today in Libya, following the assassination of Muammar Gaddafi. I'm stating the truth, and if you can oppose this, if you can challenge this effectively, bring it on. I'm here to listen. It's open to your discussion. Whatever you want to bring it. Gaddafi must be told in the face that Black Africa has had enough from Arab and European expansionism, which resulted in colonialism, slavery, and the loss of the African identity and personality. That Black Africa fought and freed itself from shackles of colonialism long time ago. And finally, that Africans need not define their identity by any imported heritage, including Islam. Again, those are the words of the author. Now, true, somewhat, but it was aimed at the wrong man and with the ultimate purpose to uplift the apex villains, which are the French, British, Americans, and those clans. The article. By his impulsive utterances and actions, Gaddafi has shown quite clearly that he has no respect for black people, and he sees sub-Saharan Africa as lost people only to be converted to Islam. I call on the African Union, the European Union, there it is, apex predator, apex killer, the Italian government, there it is again, apex predator, apex killer. You see them calling on the devils on their behalf. The United Nations is again putty within the hands of the United States, Britain, and France. And the Arab world, the Arab League, again, the Arab League hates Muammar Gaddafi and sub-Saharan African people to condemn in no uncertain terms the racial and thoughtless remarks of the Libyan leader. Gaddafi stood basically alone against these killers. In conclusion, I ask the question, upon whose names is this author calling upon? He is calling upon the chief villains, such as the European Union, the Italian government, the Arab world, to all pounce upon Muammar Gaddafi. Now this was before 2011. This is the definition of bullies. Yes, he called upon the African Union, but we know that most of the members of the African Union are cowards. And that is what we're trying to change. That is what we have been challenging the leaders in Africa to stand up like men and not be sissies. Now there is a woman who's heading the African Union, a black woman. And I'm sure in time we will get better results with her leadership than we have with these men who have been emasculated, who have been cut, who have been, well, you know what I'm talking about. This is T West with AfriSynergy.